So, as you can see from the video, American foreign policy has changed. The US, for 70 years, supported its allies in Europe and Asia unconditionally. It supported free trade, irrespective of whether you were a Democrat or Republican. It supported the stop of the spread of nuclear weapons. Under Trump, America has changed because his view of the world is much more authoritarian and nationalist rather than liberal. For instance, one of the things that Trump, one of the unusual things about Trump is that he really hates democratic leaders like Angela Merkel and the Canadian president, Justin Trudeau. And he really likes authoritarian, human rights abusing leaders like Vladimir Putin and the North Korean dictator and Roger Duterte in Philippines, who basically murders thousands of people who are accused of selling drugs without trial. So Trump's foreign policy is really about, you know, what can you pay me? Using American hard power, not using diplomacy and soft power, not being committed to allies, being very transactional, like, what can you pay me? If you cannot pay me, then we're not going to be committed to you anymore. And this is such a change in US foreign policy, and it has huge implications for the international system, like this international system that we all live in, that the US has provided global public goods. Like, one of the reasons that we can engage in free trade, one of the reasons that we can freely travel, one of the reasons that, we have common internet governance rules is because America has provided these things. And Trump's foreign policy is a move away from that. We are seeing trade wars between America and China. We're seeing the rise of authoritarianism across the world, where, like, for 20 years, democracies were increasing, but now, over the last 5 to 10 years, there are more authoritarian countries than democracies. So it's really important. So what America and Europe are experiencing is a rise in populism, or what we can call far-right nationalism. And populism, and I think you guys have the same word in French, what it means is this, like, the ordinary people versus the elites, and that the elites are just benefiting themselves and the ordinary people are suffering. So the perception that the elites have betrayed the ordinary people, or the silent majority, and this elite, they support things like globalization, migration, and international agendas because it benefits these people. And it's people who don't have a university education, that don't kind of benefit from being connected into the global economy. They suffer from these things. So really, it's nationalism versus liberalism. So nationalism is the populace, liberalism is more the sense of a cosmopolitan elite. An easy way to think about this, like the rise of right-wing parties, is what they tend to hate and what they tend to like. And if you'll see, what they tend to hate is things that are foundational to the liberal system, like immigration. So they hate uncontrolled immigration. They hate free trade. They hate the protection of minority rights, which is an important liberal value. They don't like solving global problems like climate change with global institutions. They believe that every nation should be able to decide for itself. What they tend to like is control over borders, like restricting immigration, protecting domestic industries from foreign competition, majority rule. So if a political party is elected by the majority that votes to throw out immigrants, to deprive immigrants and refugees of their rights, the government should be able to do that. and also prioritizing national interests above else, such as America First. So they are nationalists, suspicious of globalization, and therefore suspicious of the international liberal order. Populists tend to say things like fake news, corrupt elites, and take back control. The common people are the pure people. They are anti-cosmopolitan. They're suspicious of elites in media, education, and governments. They're basically suspicious of people like me, who work in universities, who are pro-liberal, who supports open borders, and they believe that we are the cosmopolitan elites, and we support global institutions, globalization, because it benefits us, but it deprives them of economic security and, living in a country that they recognize. And the problem that a lot of European liberals and American liberals is that there is a rise of populism in Europe. They are gaining greater proportions of the electoral votes. And if there's enough supporters of nationalist policies, the international liberal order is in trouble. Basically because they can block legislation that supports liberal values. So some examples of this, and I won't spend very long, you can actually just pause this if you want and look through it. But there is evidence of apathy towards multilateralism and globalization in the West. With trade, there's support for expanding international trade is weakening, and these are some examples of it. And also there's a lack of support for multilateralism. For instance, there's no major politician that's going to be extremely enthusiastic about expanding EU membership into Eastern Europe the way it was about 10, 15 years ago. And across the world, other regions are not really integrating and, sharing sovereignty. This South American regional organization still really protects sovereignty. So does the African Union, and so does the Gulf Cooperation Council. Okay, so what's happening is really two things. One is in the West, political parties are questioning the value of global institutions and security alliances. And secondly, there is a rise of alternative powers that want to challenge this Western-based order, specifically China, but also Russia. China and Russia are really dissatisfied powers. They are determined to change the terms of the Western-devised, American-policed international order that they feel do not serve their legitimate interests. We can see this in Russia. We've talked about it, where Russia became very weak after 1991. It lost control over this territory. The West took advantage of this and set up security alliances and political integration through the European Union of these Eastern European countries. This is a threat to Russian security, both internally and externally. And the real concern for Russia is that this expansion continues onto their borders. Russia really seeks a different type of international order. It's more based on, before the Second World War, where Europe was divided into nation states. There wasn't political and economic integration. Instead, you had nationalist states. And why this is beneficial to Russia is because instead of competing against a collective of 27 states, Russia can use its power more effectively by isolating individual states. If these countries are not allied together, Russian power is much easier to use. Russia is trying to do that strategy by supporting far-right nationalist party like the Front National, supporting the AfD in Germany, which is like a neo-Nazi party. And these political parties are really skeptical of Europe and the European Union. And Russia's trying to support these political parties to basically weaken and destroy the European Union. It is also heavily militarizing its western border. I think China is a more important actor, though. China wants the US military out of its geopolitical neighborhood. So, as I said, China wants to weaken these security alliances that encircle around it on its Western Pacific. And it's doing that by militarizing the South China Sea and trying to transform these allies, like the American allies, like the Philippines, into allies of China through huge economic investments. So it wants to change these security alliances. It also wants to have a greater influence over the rules of global trade. So China is developing alternative global trade institutions, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So these are all the countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Also through the Asian Development Bank, China is giving considerable amounts of money to countries in the Middle East and Central Asia. And these loans come with rules. These rules come with courts and arbitration panels that are heavily influenced by China. The final thing to note is the West is in decline economically and militarily. That doesn't mean that the West is not going to be powerful in the future. It just means that we will live in an increasingly multipolar world. China, India, these countries which have growing populations, have growing economies, are going to challenge the authority of the West in terms of security and in terms of global rules and international relations.